Greetings, folks. Sealer here. Today's replay is courtesy of my colleague Lynn Wilkie, who is sailing in the Tier 10 Italian heavy cruiser, the Venezia. This is actually a clan battle between STW and PEDS that was played a few days ago. And don't worry, I don't think I'm giving away any playbook secrets or trade secrets, of these clans. The gameplay here, I think, is pretty typical of what we see with quite a few clan battles. I wanted to use this replay to talk about the Venezia, and to some extent Italian cruisers in general, but also the Venezia in particular and how she stacks up against the other Tier 10 cruisers. So when the Italian cruisers came out, or shortly thereafter, I think we saw, or at least I saw, a lot of complaints from players about perceived shortcomings of these ships. They had longer reload times compared to their peers. They couldn't fire HE and set fires. The semi-armor piercing shells, I think, were somewhat confusing in terms of how to employ effectively, because they're dependent on the target, the angle that target is to them, armor thicknesses, and so on. And to a large extent, they act a little bit like armor-piercing shells, although they have better penetration angles, and they also have the advantage that they don't over-penetrate. But because most cruisers have high explosive, and they tend to have higher rates of fire, players that were accustomed to cruiser play that could use HE were probably quite frustrated, or could be quite frustrated, by the Italian cruisers. But then eventually, I think a lot of the player base really started to figure out how to employ these cruisers well. And so their playstyle is quite a bit different, and certainly in terms of their targeting and so forth, as Lynn lands a Citadel hit on the Des Moines, is actually going to turn the Des Moines away from capturing Bravo, which is going to be a key element of controlling this game. So the Italian cruisers, what I think effective players have figured out is that you have to be very careful about your targets that you shoot at, because you do have a lower rate of fire. It's not dissimilar to playing Battleship, where you have to sort of pick targets of opportunity, because the semi-armor piercing shells will ricochet or shatter depending upon the armor thickness and angles of the targets. But the semi-armor piercing shells will not over-penetrate, so if they do penetrate, they can do significant damage. And they're particularly effective against cruisers and destroyers. And I think a lot of destroyer players figured out fairly early on that an Italian cruiser, even if they just get a couple, 3 shells on the destroyer, can take out a lot of the destroyer's health. I've seen full health destroyers essentially made combat ineffective or completely deleted by a single salvo, or sometimes only 2 salvos from an Italian cruiser, even down to the mid-tiers. So, like I said, I think some players figured out fairly quickly that these Italian cruisers could be very powerful, but you had to be very sure about your choices of targets. And unfortunately, that salvo was a little disappointing. But Lynn is going to land several more very high alpha salvos on the couple of cruisers that are down here, the Salem and the Des Moines. In fact, we can see that the Salem has moved in. And the higher tiers of the Italian cruisers, the semi-armor piercing, have better penetration angles. In other words, they can penetrate with more steeply angled targets. Here, Lynn lands a 13K salvo with 10 of 11 shells hitting, actually penetrating. So like I said, the semi-armor piercing can be very, very potent, but you have to be very sure of what target you're going to shoot at, and the angle they are, and where on the ship you're going to shoot, in order to get consistent damage. Now, I did do a sort of an impromptu query on the World of Warships Reddit recently, looking for feedback from players of the Venezia and other high-tier cruisers to get their opinions. And generally speaking, the Venezia is perceived as being potentially as effective, if not more effective, than many of her peers. However, she is very dependent on her allies to be able to support her in order for her to be effective. The Italian cruisers have relatively little utility because they carry no hydro, no defensive fire, no radar. They have the exhaust smoke that I mentioned earlier. They obviously will get a plane in some cases, like the Venezia. They have a heel at tier 9 and tier 10. But they are very dependent on allies to be able to spot for them and provide them these opportunities where they can get on a flank, like Lynn is doing here with his allied Kleber, to put pressure on opponents. So Lynn is come over to this far west side and is basically, with the Kleber, has denied the opponents their ability to take what in theory should be the easy cap for them to take. So in most of these clan battles on these maps, there's one cap that is in theory supposed to be easy for each team to take, and then there's a third cap that tends to be heavily contested. So on this map, the Alpha and Bravo caps, should be relatively easily taken by each team, and then the Charlie cap is where they tend to have sort of the prolonged standoffs. And with the very good speed and maneuverability of the Venezia, in combination with the allied Kleber, Lynn and the Destroyer have denied the opponents from being able to take Bravo. In fact, here we see the Des Moines is having to leave the cap again. And Lynn has made the observation. Lynn is a very experienced cruiser player. I respect his opinion a great deal. And in his opinion, he felt like the Venezia was the one cruiser that he kind of feared when he played other tier 10 cruisers, including like the Hindenburg or some of the other hard hitters. He felt like the Venezia had such good alpha, unless you were really optimally angled, basically bow on or stern on, that the Venezia was very, very powerful. But again, it is very dependent on its allies. I think most ships are dependent on their allies, but the Venezia is particularly dependent to be able to execute in these flanking sort of situations than many of its peers, because if it's trying to go alone and it has no hydro or no defensive fire or none of the other consumables to provide it some protection, it can get isolated fairly easily. And one of the other disadvantages of trying to be alone as an Italian cruiser on the flank is if you use your smoke like you do here, if no one's spotting for you, not only can the opponents not see you, but you can't see the opponent. So again, there's a pretty high dependency when wanting to use this smoke. Now we can see that Lynn's team is gotten a very significant upper hand. The two battleships they ram each other. That's probably the right choice, because at this point I think it's pretty clear to both teams who the winner or the victor is going to be. The opponents have only two ships left, the Stalingrad and the Venezia. One other observation I should make of the Venezia is that she has some very trollish armor. She can be badly punished when full broadside in terms of getting taking citadel hits from battleships or heavy cruisers, but she also has some very interesting spaced armor schemes that allow her to tolerate hits from many battleships and heavy cruisers to mitigate damage. And so they are also seen as quite tanky under the right circumstances. So a lot of things going for the Venezia and the Italian cruisers, despite some of their limitations, like I said, around reload, around the particulars of the SAP shells, as he lands a 14K hit on the Stalingrad, which again is a ship that I think most people perceive as overpowered and sort of unnaturally tanky for a tier 10 cruiser. Lynn is landing some really strong shots here on the Stalingrad. Didn't quite finish him off, but the Stalingrad is burning and is going to go down to fire from the Kleber. That leaves one opponent, the opposing Venezia. I'm going to speed up the replay here just a tad because there's just some long-range gunnery here for the next minute or so, and we'll get back to a normal speed here in just a moment. But Lynn is going to focus out his colleague here in the other Venezia. There are the torpedoes. One other observation on the Italian cruisers. They have these torpedo systems that are very long range, but they're very slow torpedoes. So they're basically sort of sea mines, and they're kind of surprise torpedoes. They're not really, they're intended for sort of ambush or area denial purposes. They're not really good for sort of setting up easy kills or relatively easy kills, as Lynn lands the killing blow on his counterpart. The Venezia overall, I think, is generally seen as a very, very strong cruiser, provided that she is played correctly. I suppose that's true of any cruiser, but the Venezia has some particular strengths that I think, now that people have figured out how to play the Italian cruisers well, has done very, very well and will continue to be an extremely strong ship at Tier 10. So I hope you enjoyed the replay and the commentary. Please do leave your comments below. And as always, we hope to see you out there on the virtual seas, and we wish you happy sailing.